happy to welcome you to another one of my history and government discussions. I do these from time to time on a variety of topics, and I do them to try to help people to learn more about our wonderful nation and the incredible system of government that emanates from the unique Constitution that we operate under. I hope you enjoy this presentation, and please come back and watch some more when you have an opportunity. I do post them to YouTube once they are completed, and I've had a chance to edit them in a minor way at least. So I hope that you will be able to join us very often. And so here, let's get underway for today. The topic today that we're taking a look at is generally and most largely called reapportionment. This is a function that by law, which you'll find out about in a moment, needs to take place every 10 years. And it is according to the Constitution, as we'll lay out in a second. And it's very important because it's a reshuffling of the deck and can make a huge amount of difference. It's also referred to as redistricting. But time, it has acquired the nickname of gerrymandering. And we'll explain about that in a second here. Okay, the original gerrymander. This was printed in March of 1812 following the 1810 census. This political cartoon was a reaction in Massachusetts to the construction of this odd-looking congressional district. And you see that it acquires this odd shape. And so it satirized the bizarre shape of a dragon-like monster, and the Federalist newspaper editors and others at the time likened it to a salamander. And because the governor at that time was this man, Elbridge Gerry, it became known as Gerrymander. Now, this guy has got quite an unusual history, and we don't pay much attention to him, but he was a founding father, for sure. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a critic but participant in the Constitution. He was a congressman, a diplomat, the fifth vice president, and he was pretty well known during his day. He was kind of a wild-eyed eccentric. He was near the end of his life when all of this is happening. Anyway, he gets the label that's now stuck with us, and it's probably what he's most famous for, gerrymandering. What does the Constitution say about it? It's in Section 2, and says the House of Representatives is going to be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. And you have to have been 25 years old, been 7 years a citizens of the United States, and you need to actually reside in the state where you're being chosen. Though interestingly, you don't need to reside in the district from which you are being elected, though that rarely is a problem. And of course, one of the things that they wound up doing is having to decide how were the people who were Indians and African Americans going to be represented. And so finally, after a lot of going back and forth, they decided that the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed, are going to be 3/5 of all other persons. So it meant that all of the Black people of the country, and there were a lot of them in the South especially, were 3/5. Very controversial section. Notice in the Constitution, the word slavery or enslavement is never mentioned. They use these other oblique terms. And so the enumeration that the Constitution talks about is we got to have a census every 10 years. And after every 10 years, then we take and reapportion, redistrict, or gerrymander. And we're going to do it for every 30,000 people initially, but each state is guaranteed one representative. I think it's interesting. This was a provision in the Constitution that lays out what they're initially going to have as representation. And I think the spelling of the word choose amuses me. But anyway, that's how they started out. Not terribly important how they began. they were going to be 30,000 until the number shall amount to 100, after which they're going to let Congress decide how many should be there. Now, initially, they started debating about 40,000 as a number. And by the way, the executive in each state determines how a person will be replaced. The constitutional debate was intense. This was probably the most important part of the Constitutional Convention. They postponed dealing with the presidency and the Supreme Court until near the end of the Constitutional Convention, which ran from May 25th until September 17th of 1787. Finally, about July 16th, they came up with the Connecticut Compromise. And in that, they specified that they're going to be one representative for every 40,000. Now, 40,000. But George Washington steps down from the rostrum. Remember, he was presiding over the convention. And the only time he makes any comments in the Constitutional Convention is he says, 40,000 is not right. That should be 30,000. And they respected him. And so they changed it to 30,000. Now, that formula applied today, would mean that our approximately 330 million people divided by 30,000 would yield 11,000 people in the House of Representatives. Can you imagine the chaos that that would entail? Simply impossible. For example, Oakland Park's population is 45,000 alone. That would represent nearly 4 members of Congress. Wilton Manors alone has 12,000 members. So we would have lots of representatives running around, and it's just unworkable. The Anti-Federalists maintained that the House of Representatives was too small. Initially, it was only going to be 65 members, and they thought that there should be more. They said actually some of the state legislatures had more than that. The Anti-Federalists also attacked the biennial elections of representatives. You see, they were looking back to the Articles of Confederation, where members of Congress had 1-year terms and were subject to recall and could only serve 3 years in a 6-year period. The Constitution did not have recall or rotation in office provisions. And you want to know, I have an opinion, and that is that we should limit the amount of time people can serve in Congress. At the time that this Constitution was written, nobody thought anyone was going to live as long as we tend to live these days. And I think that if we allowed 6 2-year terms for members of the House and 2 6-year terms for the Senate, that would be adequate. But in their self-interest, they're never going to even propose it. So the Federalists countered concerns that the House was too small by pointing out it would increase in size as the population increased, and it has done exactly that. Now, here's a little piece of the Constitution that you don't probably know about, and it's called the First Amendment. No, the First Amendment is not part of the Bill of Rights, and here's why. It's called the Congressional Apportionment Amendment, and originally was titled Article the First, a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution that addresses the number of seats in the House of Representatives. Now, initially, when they sent out the Constitution for ratification to the states, they didn't have a Bill of Rights. But as the different states with their constitutional conventions debated this, there were many of them that said, no, there should be a Bill of Rights. It should include this and this and this and this. And so different states said that their approval of the Constitution was subject to these different Bill of Rights proposals. Ultimately, there were like 35 of them. Now, some of them were duplicative. So when they finally get to the first Congress, James Madison takes that 35 and he boils it down to about, I think it was 17 or 18. And then as they debated in Congress, they further refined that down to 12 Bills of Rights. And those 12 are then sent out to the various states for ratification. The First Amendment was proposed on September 25th, 1789. and it was never ratified by the requisite number of state legislatures. And it's still sitting there. In the beginning, and up until more recently, they didn't put a time limit on constitutional amendments when they sent them out. And so they still sit there. And the amendment is still pending. As of 2021, it's one of 6 unratified amendments. They've been sent through Congress, sent out to the states, but have not been ratified. The First Amendment, put together, anyway, it was one of the constitutional amendments, and it's only one of the 12 amendments which was never ratified. 10 amendments, as you know them, as the Bill of Rights, were ratified pretty quickly. The other amendment, Article the 2nd, was ratified as the 27th Amendment, but it took until 1992 for the 27th Amendment to finally be ratified by 3/4 of the states. What does the 27th Amendment say? It says that Congress may not increase its pay during the time in which it's serving. It can increase the salary or pay of the subsequent Congresses, but not of their own. But it took from 1789 until 1992 for that one to pass. But the majority of the states did ratify the Congressional Apportionment Amendment. By the end of 1791, the amendment was just one state short of adoption. Almost could have happened. However, no state has ratified the amendment since 1792. Okay, Federalist number 55. This is basically James Madison. That's where they talk about the size of Congress, and he addresses the subject of balance. The ability of the body to legislate, the need for legislators to have a relationship close enough to the people, to understand their local circumstances, and but they needed to be, I don't know, just a sense of balance in how the representation is all determined. Now comes to the next major act, is the Apportionment Act of 1911. Public Law 62.5 raised the membership of the U.S. House to 433 and provided for an apportionment. It also provided for additional seats upon the admissions of Arizona and New Mexico, which was just about to happen, in increasing the number to 435 in 1912. Reapportionment, however, sat there in 1921. Congress, remember we had a census in 1920, but Congress failed to reapportion when the House membership is required. This failure to reapportion may have been politically motivated. Do you suppose it would have been politically motivated? The newly elected Republican majority may have feared the effect that would have had on their future ability to dominate. A reapportionment in 1921, in the traditional fashion, would have increased the size of the House to 483 seats. But guess why they didn't do that? The House chamber did not have adequate seats to encompass 483 members. As it is, there are no desks in the House of Representatives because 435 people, they have chairs for them to sit, but nowhere for them to sit at a desk as they do in the Senate. By 1929, no reapportionment had been made since 1911, and there was vast representational inequity measured by the average district size. Some states had districts twice as large as others, and this was not permissible. So they passed the Reapportionment Act of 1929, which caps the size of the House at 435, which, as you well know, is the current number, the established permanent method for apportioning a constant 435 seats. The only time when that is violated is when both Alaska and Hawaii entered the Union in the same year, 1959, and they were each granted one additional seat. And then after the 1960 census, it's all reapportioned back to 435. And that's what we have now, and I suspect we always will have. Now, just for your minor interest, here is the average number of people per congressman in the various seats from the 1790, when there were 34,000 plus, and 1903, nearly 200,000. And then it goes on and up and up and up until we get to the current time when, as of 2023, when Congress convenes, each representative will be allotted approximately 761,000 people in their district. Now, another thing that has been proposed is something called the Wyoming Rule. And it's a proposal to increase the size of the House so that the standard representation to population would be that of the smallest entitled unit, which is currently the state of Wyoming. It could in later time be another state, but in recent time, that is the lowest population state. Under Article 1, every state is guaranteed at least one representative. So this disparity has grown and so forth. And so what they do is if they would, they have not done this and will not do it, I'm sure, but a total of 547 seats would have been required to implement the Wyoming Rule based on the 2010 United States Census results. You know, understanding how this works, it would be they would take the Wyoming Rule and then they would divide that number out across the various states and allocate the congressional representation. And that 573 as of the 2020 census. So we would be up by, what is that, 138 or something like people. Under the Wyoming Rule, California would gain the most seats with 17 more members than it will have after the next reapportionment. And then the chart on the next page is going to show what that would look like in actuality. States like South Dakota with 2 seats would have the most seats per capita. North Dakota's lone seat was 779, the fewest. And so you see how it would play out. States with only 1 seat, which fall short of getting an extra seat, would be North Dakota, Alaska, and Vermont, and by definition, Wyoming. Now here's the chart that shows how that would play out. And we're not going to get into the detail of this, but I will call your attention to 2. California would go from what will be 52 seats in the next Congress to 69. Our own Florida would go from 28 to 37. And here are the third of the states. And we're not going to pay any attention to the specific detail, but if you wanted to ever check this out, I'm certainly happy to provide this detail for you. Where it becomes interesting is when we get to the end and you take a look and you see that that would increase the number of seats to 670. Well, the Wyoming will be a 573, I'm sorry, in the Congress, in the House. But in terms of the electoral vote, which currently is 538, it would increase that to 673. So you think, oh, okay. Well, what would that do to the presidential election? Well, that I did check, and it would make no difference. It's just a different number at the end. In the 2016 and the 2020 election, it would have elected Trump in 2016 and would have elected Biden in 2020. But it is interesting to see how that would play out. Again, there aren't enough seats in the House for this to happen, so it's just kind of academic stuff that people play with. So what are the layers or laws of the redistricting? First of all, we pay a great deal of attention to the Voting Rights Act, which has been diluted. We'll talk more about how that's been diluted in a few minutes, but it's very important as a national law governing how we do our election allocation, our reapportionment, our gerrymandering, if you would. It's important that the seats be competitive. This is a rule. You need to make them competitive. You need to respect communities of interest. Now, communities of interest can be economic, but the law now says they cannot be racial, except that they can be racial, just because being racial sometimes dictates an economic factor. Maintain political subdivisions. In other words, it's not really smart to divide a city or divide a county or divide a township if you don't have to do it. So you try to keep them as much contiguous as possible. And you need to keep it as compact as possible. And you'll see some egregious errors that I'm going to point out in a few minutes of why that's not happening. Contiguity. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that very well, but contiguity. They need to be contiguous if at all possible. Now, in the fundamental rule enforced or reinforced by the Supreme Court is one person, one vote, equal population to the extent that is possible or practicable. Considerations. Compactness should be a very important one. The less distance there is from one part of the district to the other, the better it is. They need to be contiguous. You can't separate them. You can't have part of it in one area and then you can't have another district in between. They need to be contiguous and follow pre-existing boundaries, town or county lines whenever possible. And almost always that is possible. Each congressional district must be geographically continuous. Each district in a state must have approximately the same number of voters. States cannot gerrymander for race. They can't gerrymander for race, but they may gerrymander for political party gain. Yes, you can do that. A majority-minority districts, districts where the minority racial group is the majority, was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1996. Up until then, there were a lot of those kind of districts that were created, and we'll talk about those as being packing in a moment. Westbury versus Sanders, 1964 US Supreme Court case, says that each district must have these rules. One person, one vote. One district cannot have 50,000, another 500,000. They need to be, in a rough approximation, the same size. It's a way to keep these groups from voting. States could do one of the two following things. Now, these are very clever. Packing or stacking, they're very similar. Some people take them and use a different definition for each one, but they're really essentially the same thing. Where you put all of the people from the targeted group into one district so they have only one representative and therefore not much power. Now, here's a little map. I hope you can see the gray areas representing two minority blocks. If you're going to pack this, what you do is you draw a district where, in fact, those two groups are put together with a narrow corridor. And so you've taken all of the minority and you pack them into one area. Now you can do this for economic reasons as well, but largely this is a racial discrimination technique that's been widely used. And the other one is cracking. You spread out the targeted group among as many districts as possible so they would have no impact on the election. Here's our same little area, two minority group blocks in gray. And so you draw the districts so that they will never have a representative. You'll notice they are in a minority in each one of those districts. And they never, ever get any direct representation in Congress. And so this is the kind of thing that people are balancing all the time as they're putting together the reapportionment and redistricting.
The social scientists say that there are three traditional methods to dilute minority voting strength: stacking, cracking, and packing. Stacking is if you have a concentration of minority population, you dump on a bigger concentration of majority population, so the majority will control a seat in that district. And cracking, if you have a district that's majority minority and minority voters can elect a candidate of choice, if you want to crack it, you will divide that district up into 3 or 4 districts so that all the districts are majority white. Sometimes the minority population is so concentrated that you can't stack it and you can't crack it. So under those circumstances, the technique is to pack it. And we were talking about a case recently in South Dakota where they did precisely that. They packed the district with 93 or 94% Indian population to make sure that they would limit the number of majority Indian districts.
Okay, so we're gonna lose a little hypothetical here. This is a little map of 50 precincts. 60% of them are blue or in Democrat, 40% are Republican. So we're going to divide this hypothetical little example into 5 districts with 10 precincts per district. And so what we can do is we have the legislature meet. And so what the legislature does is it draws a line like that. And then it draws another line like that. Still another line and a 4th line. And guess what? All Democrats win all 5. Now, if the Democrats are in the state legislature and they're deciding things, hey, that's very tempting because you keep your power base and perhaps expand it. But it's eminently unfair as well. So you have 6-4, 6-4 in each one of those hypothetical districts. So let's look at it a little different way. 50 precincts divided into 5 districts at 10 precincts per district. Okay, so here we draw some lines in a different way. Now this one happens to be a very prominent Democrat district. And if you can look, you can see there are 9 Democrat precincts and 1 Republican. We go on further and we draw some more lines. And when we're done drawing lines, lo and behold, we have 2 Democrat districts and 3 Republicans, even though the Democrats have 60% of the vote in this particular hypothetical example. Republicans win 3, Democrats only 2. So here's another way to look at it. Here we go. These are proportional. So here you can draw a line, north and south, and north and south, and north and south, and north and south. And so you wind up with Democrats winning 3 and Republicans winning 2, except that the problem with this particular allocation is that whoever is a Democrat in the blue has no effort to represent citizens who are in the minority. And they probably should be doing that. And those people who are in the minority have a right to have a voice with the majority. And it doesn't happen. So another way to do this is to take and divide these proportionately. And here you can wind up with Democrats here win 3, Republicans win 2, but representation is more fairly distributed between the 2 parties, so that whoever is representing either one has to represent the minority as well as the majority. Now I'm going to take you to the beautiful state of Franklin. Beautiful state of Franklin is a nice boxy looking state, just like Nebraska or South Dakota or North Dakota and so forth. And it has 9 precincts in it. You can see the population by Republican being red and Democrat being blue in each one of those precincts in the state. So the state legislature meets and they divide the state into 3 congressional districts. And that's how they draw the line. And so the vote is taken. And in that northern district, 110,000 to 26,000, Robbie Republican wins. In the middle district, center district, with 156,000 Democrats to 20,000 Republicans, Debbie Democrat wins. And down in the south, 127 to 90,000, Rhonda Republican wins. And so 2 Republicans win and go to Washington. Well, let's see what happens if we look at this a little different way. Legislature meets, instead they draw the lines this way. And in this case, Debbie Democrat wins over on the west, 94 to 31,000, and Doris Democrat wins 151 to 135,000. And Robbie Republican is able to win in the east, 91 to 27,000. And in this case, 2 Democrats win and go to Washington. Now, these are oversimplified charts, but this is basically what happens.
So, you want to know what gerrymandering is? First, let's start with Government 101. In the United States, each state elects a certain number of representatives based on the state's population. The larger your population, the more representatives you have. Each representative represents a district, or a geographical area including its voters. Ideally, we want to have a range of representatives who reflect the political views of the population across the state. But how do we decide who gets to vote for each representative? Let's look at an example. Suppose we have a very tiny state of 50 people. 30 of them belong to the blue party, and 20 belong to the red party. And just our luck, they all live in a nice even grid with blues on one side of the state and reds on the other. Now, let's say we need to divide the state into 5 districts. Each district will send one representative to the House to represent the people. Fortunately, because our citizens live in a neatly ordered grid, it's easy to draw 5 lengthy districts, 2 for the reds and 3 for the blues. Voila! Perfectly proportional representation, just as the founders intended. Now, let's say instead that the blue party controls the state government, and they get to decide how the lines are drawn. Rather than draw districts horizontally, they draw them vertically, so that in each district there are 6 blues and 4 reds. With a comfortable blue majority in the state, each district elects a blue candidate to the House. The blues win 5 seats, and the reds don't get a single one. Well, finally, what if the red party controls the state government? The reds know they're at a numerical disadvantage, but with some creative boundary drawing, they can slice the blue population up such that they only get a majority in 2 districts. So despite making up 40% of the population, the reds win 60% of the seats. Not bad. This process of redrawing district lines to give an advantage to one party over another is called gerrymandering, and it's nothing new. The term gerrymander is named after early 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who redrew the map of the Senate's districts in 1810 in order to weaken the opposing Federalist Party. Our example is, of course, a huge simplification. In the real world, people don't live in neatly ordered grids sorted by political party. But for politicians looking to give themselves an advantage at redistricting time, the process is exactly the same, and the consequences are very real. Gerrymandering is at least partly to blame for lopsided representation in the House seen in recent elections. And, it's been argued by the president, for political polarization, since representatives don't have to compromise hardline views in order to win seats. So,
Okay, so it's simplification and so forth. Now, something that we're not going to spend, I'm going to let somebody else in a video tell you about this, but it's going to be a factor that's considered by various reapportionment experts throughout the next year or so, and it's called the efficiency gap. Both cracking and packing produce votes that are wasted in the sense that they don't contribute to a candidate's victory. In the case of cracking, all votes cast for the losing candidate are wasted. In the case of packing, all votes cast for the winning candidate above 50% plus 1 are wasted. The efficiency gap is calculated by taking one party's total wasted votes in elections, subtracting the other, and so forth. And anyway, it's not something you and I will pay a lot of attention to, but the guys that go into the back room and they get on the computers and they're trying to get this all straightened out in the next year, they're going to be spending time looking at the efficiency gap.
You know the feeling. It's election day, right where you live, and most of your friends and most of your neighbors and pretty much everybody in your district favors the same party. So you can vote, but if you don't vote, you know your side's going to win, which makes your vote, how do I put this, a little unnecessary. Or maybe it's the opposite. So many people in your area like the other party, you are such a pitiable minority that whether you vote or not, you know you're going to lose to them. So either way, going to vote seems a waste of your time. In a way, the game's been fixed. With computers these days, state legislatures can take a state where there's 60% red voters and 40% blue voters. And if you draw the lines this way, the blues win every district in the state, a clean sweep, even though they aren't 100% of the voters. Or you could draw the lines this way. And in this case, the reds win 3 out of 5 seats. So they're the minority. And it'll stay this way for 10 years until the next census. So, here's the question. Is this legal? Well, the Supreme Court has signaled it might not be, if there's a clear and neutral way to show that a political party has rigged the game on its own behalf. When you consider how much political power depends on these lines, the stakes here are enormous. So 2 professors created a simple formula, a mathematical way to say the game has been rigged. Basically, they ask how many voters in this state could say, yesterday my vote didn't matter. Or putting it another way, how many votes was the winner?
A lot of votes, they say, are wasted. I don't think we mean by wasted.
Well, if you get one more vote than the next guy, then you win. If you get two more votes or 10,000 more votes, you don't need them. Those are extra. The professors call them wasted votes. If you vote for a losing candidate, well, you haven't won anything, so in effect, your vote is wasted there. So that's what they do. They pile up this category called wasted votes, and then they create what they call efficiency gap formula. I don't expect you to grab this in one gulp, but here's what they do. Take the number of wasted votes for the winner and for the loser, subtract the smaller number from the larger number like this, you get a net number, divide that number by the total number of votes cast. If the proportion of wasted votes is too high, something's wrong. Generally, if the difference is 8%, if that gap, that line there is 8% or more, that's a red flag. In Wisconsin, in the 2012 elections, the efficiency gap was 13.3%. The lower courts say this is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court will hear the case in October, and if the court agrees, then every district line in the country can be exempt. Every state in the nation.
Now, I will mention that in the case that the little video is referring to that did get to the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to deal with that. And they sent it back to the lower courts. And what the Supreme Court has been wrestling with, and they have moved increasingly in this direction, are avoiding things that are political and should not belong in the Supreme Court. Is something justiciable? Justiciable. New word for us. Gill versus Whitford, 2017. This is the case that they were obliquely referring to that was going to get to the Supreme Court. And I'm not going to go into all the detail of this, but basically what it's saying is that they just said they're not going to deal. It's not justified, not justiciable. You cannot deal with this. And so they dismissed the case and they sent it back to the lower courts. It's unfortunate, because the Supreme Court probably should get more involved in these things than they have been. The doctrine refers to the idea that an issue is so politically charged that federal courts were typically supposed to be viewed as the apolitical branch of the government should not hear the issue. The doctrine is also referred to as the justiciability doctrine or the non-justiciability doctrine. Now, the one place, of course, this is long before 2017, where the Supreme Court did get, and many people believe it was inappropriately get involved in, was Florida in 2020, or I'm sorry, in 2000, when they basically ruled a ruling that ultimately elected George Bush, a minority candidate, as the president. Supreme Court views. Justice Felix Frankfurter in 1962, this court's authority, possessed of neither the purse nor the sword, ultimately rests on the sustained public confidence in its moral sanction. Such feeling must be nourished by the court's complete detachment, in fact, and in appearance, from political entanglements, and by abstention from injecting itself into the clash of political forces in political sentiments. A little later on, we have Earl Warren in 1964. He's basically saying that we should have even representation, one party, one vote, in the way in which issues are decided in terms of. Now, I'm going to point out a bunch of abuses that have taken place. And let me qualify this by saying I wasn't always able to determine abuses that are absolutely in place as of 2021, because there have been some of these that have been corrected in Pennsylvania, for example, and in North Carolina. But nevertheless, these are abuses that have taken place in the relatively recent past, one way or the other. In recent election, Democrats won in 9 out of the 10 most gerrymandered districts, but 8 of those 10 of those districts were drawn by Republicans. Now I'm going to make the Republicans sound like the bad guy here. Let me qualify that to begin with and say that the Democrats have done and will do exactly the same thing. So it just happens that the reapportionment process has tilted towards Republicans in recent time. This speaks to the notion that the point of gerrymandering isn't to draw yourself a safe district, but put your opponents in safe seats by cramming all of their supporters into a smaller number of districts. So you can spread your own supporters over a large number of districts. Now, North Carolina's 12th district holds the title of the nation's most gerrymandered. It's a textbook example. It snakes from north of Greensboro to Winston-Salem and then all the way down to Charlotte, spanning most of the state in the process. And we'll show you what that one looks like in a second. 3 of the 10 most gerrymandered districts were in North Carolina. They were in addition to the 12th, they were in the 4th and in the 1st districts. And interestingly, all of these 3 seats were won by Democrats in 2012. Based on their statewide vote share, you'd expect North Carolina Democrats to hold about 7 seats, but they won only 4. This is because of an outsized share of the state's Democratic voters were shunted off into the 3 highly gerrymandered districts up above. So here's what it looks like. There is that one district, the 12th. Look at how that thing wanders all the way almost from the northern border to the southern border of North Carolina. You can take a look over to the right at the 1st district, and you can take a look at the 3rd district, and you can see how those too have been twisted and curved. The 2nd district, all of them have got odd shapes. They are not contiguous and they are not compact. Further abuses. Indiana and Nevada get a pat on the back as the states with the least amount of gerrymandering. In contrast, North Carolina Republicans, Indiana did a remarkably good job of drawing sensible district boundaries, and that was true in Nevada, where there are only 4 districts. Maryland and North Carolina are essentially tied for the most gerrymandered states. Now, they do develop, and I'll mention it here in a minute, a gerrymander score, an average of gerrymander score, about 80 out of a possible 100. Maryland and North Carolina are home to some of the ugliest districts in the nation among states with at least 3 congressional districts. In fact, North Carolina is home to 3 out of the top 10 most gerrymandered districts in the country. Maryland is proof that gerrymandering isn't just a Republican pastime, as the state's Democrats redrew those boundaries in 2012. The standout is the 3rd congressional district, the nation's 2nd most gerrymandered, and home to Democratic Congressman John Sarbanes. And here is the gerrymander score issue, and you can see the most gerrymandered are the darker ones. The compactness of a district, measured using the ratio of the district area to the area of the circle with the same perimeter, can serve as a useful proxy for how gerrymandered the district is. This map shows the congressional districts according to their compactness for states with at least 3 districts. And just to note, where are they? They're in West Virginia, to some degree in Pennsylvania. They are in Kentucky. They are in Arkansas, Texas, New Mexico a little bit, North Carolina. These are in Louisiana. These are the sitting states, most sitting states. Abuses. Republicans drew congressional districts in 6 of the 10 most districts. In addition to North Carolina, Republicans drew district boundaries in Louisiana, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Alabama. Democrats drew districts in West Virginia and Illinois, in addition to Maryland. Boundaries in Kentucky were drawn up by the state's mixed legislature. Again, the payoff for Republicans is the makeup of the state's delegations. In those 6 states, Republicans picked up about 11 more seats than you'd expect from simply looking at the party's vote shares. And many of the highly irregular districts are clustered around cities and metro areas. And there are more people in a given area, partisans have more leeway in how to draw their districts. Here's Maryland's 3rd, and these are numbers from last fall, September 2020. Maryland's gerrymandering takes it to a whole new level with the 3rd district that we've already mentioned. This seat has been drawn by Democrats, and you see how it wanders in an odd configuration. Some parts of the district barely hooked together by one road or something. Massachusetts 7th. And here again, you have a long, narrow district. So you wonder why. The 7th district covers about 70% of the city of Boston, while the majority of the rest is in the 8th district. The 7th has a much larger proportion of Black people living within its borders and has a median income that's about $22,000 less per year than the 8th. It's possible that this is a gerrymander built along class lines, combining more affluent areas of Boston with the suburbs to create the 8th and packing the lower income residents into the 7th. Pennsylvania's 7th. February 2018, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually ruled that the state's congressional boundaries were unconstitutional, demanded a new map. In particular, they called attention to the 7th district. It became a national joke, and people who were doing this for a living called it Goofy Kicking Donald Duck as an image. After the court ruling, the Republicans in the state legislature produced a new congressional map, and that was vetoed by the Democrat governor. Eventually, the task of creating a map fell to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. A new version came out in February 2018, and it has much cleaner districts than had been there previously. Florida's 5th. This district actually looks a lot better than it used to, thanks to the Florida Supreme Court. The old boundaries were considered just really too insane. The new district has problems, however. It has taken Tallahassee and split it in half, and it's taken Jacksonville and split it in half, and they're tied together in one district. They don't have the same interests. The new district has a plurality Black population, while the other districts that make up Jacksonville and Tallahassee, the 4th and 2nd, are majority white. Is the race a factor? Even though race cannot be considered, don't you suppose somebody quietly was considering it? This is known as packing, where you're getting people of a certain group all shoved into one district. And in the process, the 4th and 2nd are now safely Republican, and the 5th is safely Democrat. In a fair system, the borders of these districts would be more locally concentrated, our elections to be much more competitive. Utah's 4th. You wouldn't think Utah would have much of a problem out there with all those good Mormons. Only 4 congressional seats, but they do gerrymandering in a different way. There's a lot of power in Salt Lake City, but they have taken and diluted that by putting it into 4 different congressional districts so that the rural area of Utah has a disproportionate influence on the decisions that are made. And therefore a great advantage to the Republicans in the state of Utah. This is Louisiana's 2nd. Been under fire for packing Black voters in and suppressing their vote in other districts. These Black voters believe that they should be able to have representation that's more evenly spread. And so far, nothing has changed there. Texas 35th. Of course, Texas has got to have a problem, doesn't it? It may seem surprising that a state with such a clear Republican majority would practice gerrymandering, but that might be why they have such a large majority. Lots of evil going on out there. This is the 35th. This has a majority Latinx population. It's the only one of the 3 districts firmly held by Republicans. Lloyd Doggett is representing this district, and they were trying to get him out, but even by doing what they were rearranging, they weren't able to do it, and he's still in Congress. It's likely that's going to get redrawn when things come down to the final analysis. Illinois 4th. This is one of my favorite ones. This is called the Earmuff. Located in the heart of Chicago, Illinois 4th, most obviously gerrymandered district in the United States. 2 neighborhoods that are not connected at all, except by one little road, are put together. In the north, that's primarily a Puerto Rican area. And down in the south, that's a Mexican American area. And while they both are Latin kind of populations, they are Latin populations that really don't have a great deal in common. The median household income here is also very low, hovering below $40,000 a year. These are called the earmuff districts. It's really quite racist to do this. Now, if you'll notice the white area that this goes around, which is right in the center, that involves the Illinois 7th. And the Illinois 7th is home to the majority Black population of voters. And it's a notorious gerrymandering that's been going on in the state of Illinois, so that neither of these represent the true diversity of the area. While these have been challenged, so far nothing has been redrawn. In Texas again, Dan Cranshaw, he's the guy with the eye patch, if you can remember who he is. This is Texas, one of 4 states with a majority minority population. Whites make up less than 50% of the population of Texas. And the Latinx and Black population is on the rise and rising rapidly. Even though minorities make up over 2/3 of the new Texas residents, between 2000 and 2010, the minorities actually lost representatives over that period of time. Texas has received more representatives in the past decade, thanks to its population increase, but almost all of the new states, and we're going to get 2 more, by the way, as of this last reapportionment, won by the Republicans. That's because the white voters account for about 70% of the population of all congressional districts, even though they only make up 45% of Texas's population. Houston is particularly impacted because the city's minority population is cracked and redistributed to more Republican safe districts. Ohio's 11th, another one, goes way north and south. Democrats usually get 80% of the vote in this district, but if they were spread over 2 districts, they could potentially get more seats. This is racial gerrymandering. 40% of the population in this particular district is Black. And by combining the Blacks of 2 different cities, it's a surefire way of diminishing their influence in either city. And this has been widely condemned even by some Republican leaders. Texas 33rd, another one that's strung out, as you can see. Here, a Republican won a landslide victory, and it might not have happened if the district wasn't so gerrymandered. It's part of Dallas and neighboring Fort Worth, drawn by Republicans to give them an advantage. Cities tend to be more liberal than rural areas, and Dallas is no exception. Why it's been split and so forth. Hispanic voters in the 33rd don't have as large a say in the election, even though Dallas has a significant Latino population. I had to throw this one in. This is not current, but it is not, so this is 2000. But notice a couple of these districts. Notice the green one in the just south of the metro area, where you've got it just weaving all over the place, where they've hooked in that one area. It looks like they barely have a sidewalk keeping the sections together. The blue areas similarly just strung out in odd configurations, barely keeping themselves connected to one another. I don't know how they've done this, but when you go into the Miami or into the Atlanta area, there's one little thin road that's connecting a section. Some of the outstate districts are also strung out in odd ways, like the 12th district and the 1st district. But this was another area of abuses. So we won't get through all of this, but I'll begin anyway. What's new in 2021-22? Political changes and reforms. Single party control of map drawing is by far the biggest predictor of redistricting abuses. Meanwhile, several other states where maps are still drawn by legislatures that saw egregious gerrymandering last cycle now have divided governments. In the upcoming cycle, this is significant, in the upcoming cycle, Republicans will have sole control over the drawing of 181 congressional districts. Now, that's bad, but previously, after 2010, they were controlling 213. So that has been a little bit more equitable. Legal changes. The legal landscape, by contrast, is more ominous this time around. And the legal framework weakened by two major Supreme Court rulings. The Supreme Court bowed out of really doing what it should do, and this is unfortunate. 2013, the Supreme Court gutted core protections of the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder. Then in 2019, the court closed the door to federal court challenges to partisan gerrymanders in Rucho versus Common Cause. But there is some hopeful news. State courts are doing more to intervene than they were in the past. And so it's a little bit of hope there. We have had census delays. The ability to reapportion has been delayed until the final census information came out, which it did maybe 3 weeks ago. And so now they can move ahead to do things, but it's late. Some states, including Iowa and Maine, will have to make constitutional or legal changes to avoid the process being defaulted to the courts, because the timeline has already begun for many of these states. States like Texas would be required to draw maps in a special session where there are typically far fewer procedural protections and oversight opportunities. And Virginia would likely not have new maps in place in time for its 2021 legislative elections, which are just beginning to unfold. They are one of the states that does their elections in an off year. Demographic and population changes. As has always been the case, population changes will be a crucial driver of redistricting abuses. And so we have had tens of millions more Americans appear in the last 10 years. In the South, in particular, has grown rapidly and become both much more racially and politically diverse since 2011. Threatening the long-standing political status quo. You can be sure Texas, that is right now still regarded as a red state, sometime in the not too distant future it will be purple, and then it may even become blue because population is changing. Some regions have seen population decreases or significant demographic changes and could also see battles over adjustments to the maps. And there are lots of parts of the country that are quite stable and not much has changed in those states. Now, in fact, there were fewer changes this time around than they had originally forecast. I know my own Minnesota was forecast to lose one congressional seat. It turned out they did not lose that seat. It is being retained. So relative risk of mischief, high risk states. These states combine single-party political control with the redistricting process with extremely fast growth and demographic change. For the first time, however, in 50 years, they will not be required to obtain pre-approval to use maps under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And I can tell by the clock, I won't get in very far into that, but that change is enormous. Other high-risk states, these states, though they are not growing or changing as fast as the highest risk state, were formerly covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act and will also draw maps this decade under single-party control. Likely improved states, some states are actually going to improve. First of all, there are a few states where there's a divided government, and that's a good thing. Other states to watch, some saw non-white population growth in certain regions, and you could see increased fights over where the representation should go. This is high risk areas, or the risk areas, relative risk. You can see that the areas that are in, I'll call it kind of brown, are the highest risk. Those that are in yellow or gold, they are high risk. And then you see there are those states that are in the deeper blue that are improved, and then a few other states to watch and see what happens. Now, this is the general picture, and this is another way of representing it from the Cook company, dealing with reapportionment. Now, this is a little list of the places where they do not have the legislature make the decision. Many of them have independent commissions of one kind or other, sometimes a commission that's not independent. Some, like Minnesota, have divided government. The Senate is Republican, the House is Democrat, and the governor is Democrat. So that's divided government. So they have to come together eventually in order to reach a solution. And I point this map out, or this chart out to you, not because you could read any detail in it, but these are the states with single party control of redistricting in 21-22. And the one thing you need to note here is just the color red. These are the single party districts or states where control is all within one party and it's all Republican. And so those are the ones where it's really a red light. Strange things are going to happen. So who will draw the maps? The redistricting side will vividly impact single party control. After the 2010 Tea Party elections, Republicans had full control of the redistricting process in Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, with large numbers of congressional districts. With this control, Republicans were able to lock in a 10-3 advantage for congressional seats in North Carolina and a 13-5 advantage in Pennsylvania, even though voters in both states tend to split their votes almost evenly. Nationwide, the Brennan Center, which is very important in analyzing these things, found that that gerrymandering in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania alone gave, listen to this, gerrymandering in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, 3 important states with large numbers of districts, alone gave Republicans 16 to 17 more seats in the House of Representatives than would have been expected with unbiased maps. In the South, this gerrymandering had a racial dimension. Democrats likewise, though, just to be fair, gerrymandered maps in states they controlled. In Maryland, for example, they radically redrew the congressional map to gain an additional seat. But the Republicans dominated in the 2010 election. Democrats controlled far fewer states than Republicans, and where they were in charge, Democrats were generally somewhat less aggressive than Republicans in their gerrymandering efforts.